"Make us breakfast," my son and his wife ordered on Christmas morning. They didn't know I'd already sold the house they slept in. The cold snapped at my fingers as I stared out my kitchen window that Christmas morning, the New York City skyline smeared with frost and forgotten dreams. Today I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. At 72, my life had become a series of hollow echoes bouncing off empty rooms. The brownstone on the Upper West Side had been my world for 38 years. 3 stories of memories, each creaking floorboard holding the weight of children's laughter, birthday parties, Thanksgiving dinners that stretched late into the evening. Now, on this particular December morning, I stood in what used to be my kitchen, watching the steam rise from my coffee mug like ghosts of all the breakfasts I'd made for ungrateful mouths. The text message had arrived at 6:47 in the morning. "Make us breakfast," it read, followed by another ping. "And can you do laundry too? Sarah's dress needs to be ready for tonight. No, please. No, thank you." Just demands wrapped in the assumption that I existed solely for their convenience. My fingers trembled as I held the phone, not from the December cold seeping through the old windows, but from something much deeper, something that had been building for years, like sediment at the bottom of a river, until it became too heavy to ignore. You see, I had sold this house 3 months earlier. The papers were signed, the money was in my account, and in 2 weeks, the new owners would take possession. My son David and his wife Sarah had been living in the top-floor apartment rent-free for the past 4 years, treating my home like their personal hotel. They had no idea that their free ride was about to end, because I hadn't told them. Not yet. But let me take you back to understand how we got here, to this moment where a mother stands in her own kitchen, feeling like a stranger in her own life. I raised David as a single mother after his father left when David was only 8. Those were lean years in Brooklyn, where every dollar was stretched thin and every sacrifice felt worth it if it meant my son could have a better life. I worked double shifts at the hospital, my hands raw from washing bedpans and changing sheets, my back aching from lifting patients twice my size. But when David smiled, when he brought home good grades, when he hugged me tight before bed, it all felt meaningful. I scrimped and saved to buy this house when David was 15. It wasn't much then. Needed new plumbing, the roof leaked, and the heating system sounded like a dying whale. But it was ours. I remember the day we moved in, how David ran up and down the stairs claiming his room, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Mom, we're rich now," he shouted, and I laughed until I cried, because we weren't rich in money, but we were rich in hope. Those teenage years were golden. David brought friends home, and I'd make enormous pots of spaghetti, garlic bread that disappeared faster than I could bake it. The house hummed with life. Friday nights were movie nights. Just the 2 of us on the old sectional sofa I'd bought secondhand, sharing popcorn and arguing about which film to watch. David always won, and I didn't mind. Seeing him happy was my greatest joy. When he graduated high school with honors, I used my entire inheritance from my mother, $23,000, to help pay for his college tuition. I worked extra shifts to cover the rest, my body screaming protest, but my heart singing with pride. "You're going to be somebody important," I told him the day I dropped him off at NYU. "All of this is worth it." And he was somebody important, at least on paper. David graduated with a business degree and landed a job at a financial firm in Manhattan. He made good money, wore expensive suits, and drove a car that cost more than I made in a year. When he married Sarah, a beautiful woman from Connecticut with perfect teeth and designer handbags, I thought I had succeeded as a mother. My son had made it. He was living the American dream, but somewhere along the way, that dream became my nightmare. It started small, as these things usually do. "Mom, can you lend me $5,000? Just until my bonus comes through." This was 3 years after he'd graduated, when he was making 6 figures and I was still working nights at the hospital. I gave him the money from my emergency fund, the one I'd been building in case I ever got sick or couldn't work. The bonus came through, but the money never came back to me. When I mentioned it, David looked genuinely confused. "What money?" he asked, as if I'd imagined the entire transaction. That was the first crack in my foundation, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I told myself he was busy, that he'd forgotten, that it didn't matter because he was my son. Then came the bigger requests. "Mom, Sarah and I want to buy a house, but we need help with the down payment. Can you refinance this place?" I did it. I took out a second mortgage on my home, my security, my safety net, to help them buy their first property in Westchester, $47,000. Nearly half my house's equity, gone in a single afternoon at the lawyer's office. They owned that house for 8 months before selling it at a profit and buying something bigger. They never offered to pay me back. When I brought it up at Thanksgiving dinner, Sarah laughed and said, "Oh, Eleanor, money shouldn't matter between family." She said it while wearing a necklace that probably cost more than my monthly salary. That's when they moved into my top floor. Just temporarily, they said, while we look for the perfect place. That was 4 years ago. 4 years of temporary that stretched into what felt like a life sentence. Living with them was like being a ghost in my own home. They came and went as they pleased, using my kitchen without cleaning up, eating groceries they never paid for, throwing parties that kept me awake at night. When I complained about the noise, David would sigh dramatically and say, "Mom, we're adults. We don't need a curfew." When I asked them to contribute to utilities or groceries, Sarah would remind me that they were doing me a favor by keeping me company. "You'd be so lonely without us," she'd say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The loneliness, ironically, was worse with them in the house than it had ever been when I lived alone. They treated me like live-in help. Sarah would leave her dirty dishes in the sink for days, expecting me to clean them. David would drop his dry cleaning on my bed with a note asking me to pick it up because he was too busy at work. When they had friends over, I was expected to stay in my room, or, better yet, run errands, so they could have the place to themselves. I became a servant in my own home, and somehow I convinced myself this was normal. This was what mothers did. This was love, but it wasn't love. I know that now. The breaking point came last spring on my 72nd birthday. I had been battling a particularly bad case of pneumonia, spending 3 days in bed with a fever that made me delirious. David and Sarah knew I was sick. They could hear me coughing through the thin walls, see the tissues piled beside my bed when they walked past my open door, but neither of them checked on me. Not once. On my birthday morning, I dragged myself downstairs, hoping they might have remembered, might have gotten me a card, or even just wished me well. Instead, I found a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to the Hamptons for the weekend. Can you water our plants? Thanks." The house was empty. They had left me alone, sick and forgotten, on my birthday. I sat at my kitchen table and cried until I had no tears left. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I called my old friend Margaret, a real estate agent I'd known since David was in high school. "Maggie," I said, my voice still hoarse from being sick, "I want to sell the house." She didn't ask why. Maybe she could hear the finality in my voice, or maybe she remembered all the times I'd mentioned David and Sarah's behavior over the years. "Let me come over Monday morning," she said. "We'll get you top dollar for that beautiful place." The house appraised for $875,000. In the Manhattan market, even my modest Upper West Side brownstone had appreciated dramatically. After paying off both mortgages, the original one and the second one I'd taken out for David, I would walk away with nearly $400,000, enough to buy a comfortable apartment somewhere else and secure my future. The selling process took 3 months. David and Sarah never suspected anything because they never paid attention to what happened in the house unless it directly affected them. They didn't notice the appraiser who came through because I scheduled him when they were at work. They didn't see the real estate photographer because I told them he was there to update the insurance photos. They didn't question why I'd started packing some of my belongings because they assumed I was finally decluttering like Sarah had been nagging me to do for years. The lies came surprisingly easily. I had spent so many years accommodating their deceptions, their forgotten promises, their convenient amnesia about money owed, their casual cruelty disguised as concern, that a few lies of my own felt like justice. But the real shock came when I was reviewing the closing documents with my lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Williams who specialized in elder law. She had been helping me understand the tax implications of the sale when she noticed something troubling in my bank statements. "Eleanor," she said, her voice careful and controlled, "I'm seeing some unusual withdrawals from your savings account. Large amounts, taken out at odd intervals. Do you recognize these transactions?" I leaned forward to look at the papers she was pointing to. My savings account, the one I'd built up from years of working extra shifts, the one that was supposed to ensure I could afford medical care and prescriptions in my old age, had been systematically drained. $27,000 withdrawn in chunks over the past 2 years. My hands began to shake. "I don't understand. I never authorized these withdrawals." Patricia's expression grew grim. "Eleanor, someone has been accessing your account. Do you have any family members who might have your banking information?" My stomach dropped. David was on the account as a co-signer, something I'd set up years earlier in case I ever had a medical emergency and needed someone to handle my finances. I'd trusted him with that access, never imagining he would use it to steal from me. The evidence was all there in black and white. Regular withdrawals, always just under the amount that would trigger a bank notification. David had been methodically stealing from me for 2 years, taking money I'd earned with my own hands, my own sweat, my own sacrifice. That night, I went home and confronted them directly. I laid the bank statements on the kitchen table and waited for them to come downstairs for dinner. A dinner I'd prepared, as always, without being asked. "Can you explain these?" I said, pointing to the withdrawal records. David barely glanced at the papers before shrugging. "Oh, that. Yeah. Sarah and I borrowed some money here and there. We were going to pay it back." "Borrowed?" My voice climbed higher. "You took $27,000 from my savings account without asking me." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Eleanor, honestly, you're being so dramatic. We're family. What's yours is ours, right? Besides, you weren't using that money for anything important. That money was for my medical care, for emergencies, for my future." David sighed, the way he used to when I'd catch him lying as a teenager. "Mom, you worry too much about money. We'll pay it back when we can. It's not like you're going anywhere." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. It's not like you're going anywhere. As if I were a piece of furniture, permanent and disposable at the same time. But I didn't crumble. Not this time. I looked at my son, this man I had raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, and I saw a stranger, a well-dressed, articulate stranger who felt entitled to steal from his elderly mother. "You're right," I said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere. But you are." They both laughed, thinking I was making some kind of joke. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, still smiling. "I mean, this house has been sold. The closing is next Tuesday. You have 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live." The laughter died immediately. David's face went white, then red. "What are you talking about? You can't sell this house. We live here. I can sell my house anytime I want. It's my name on the deed, my signature on the mortgage, my equity you've been living off of for 4 years. Sarah stood up so quickly her chair fell over. "You can't do this to us. Where are we supposed to go? How are we supposed to find a place in 2 weeks?" "I don't know," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "But I'm sure 2 successful young professionals like yourselves will figure something out." David was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "Mom, this is insane. You're being vindictive and cruel. Can't we talk about this like adults?" "We are talking about it. I'm telling you that you need to move out." "But why didn't you tell us you were selling?" Sarah demanded, her perfect composure finally cracking. "How could you do something this major without consulting us?" "The same way you withdrew $27,000 from my account without consulting me," I replied. "The same way you've been living in my house for 4 years without paying rent, eating my food, using my utilities, and treating me like hired help." The next 2 weeks were hell. David alternated between rage and manipulation, sometimes screaming at me for being selfish, sometimes crying about how I was abandoning him. Sarah tried a different approach, bringing me flowers and cooking dinner, suddenly interested in my health and my feelings. It was remarkable how quickly she could transform from entitled princess to devoted daughter-in-law when it served her purposes. But I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Every time I wavered, every time David's tears made me want to reconsider, I remembered those bank statements. I remembered all the birthdays they'd forgotten, all the times they'd used me and discarded me, all the ways they'd made me feel invisible in my own life. On moving day, I watched from my bedroom window as they loaded their belongings into a rental truck. David was sulking, throwing boxes with more force than necessary. Sarah was on her phone, probably complaining to her friends about her crazy mother-in-law. Neither of them came to say goodbye. That evening, alone in my house for the first time in 4 years, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair. The silence was profound, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. The new owners, a young couple with twin toddlers, took possession the following week. Martha and James Chen were both doctors, hardworking and kind, with the same hopeful energy I remembered having when I first bought the house. As I handed over the keys, Martha squeezed my hand and said, "Thank you for taking such good care of this place. We can feel the love in every room." I cried then, not from sadness, but from a strange kind of joy. My house was going to be filled with love again, with children's laughter and family dinners. It was going to be what I had always wanted it to be. With the proceeds from the sale, I bought a small but elegant apartment in Brooklyn Heights, in a building with a doorman and a view of the Manhattan skyline. It was the first place I'd ever lived that was chosen entirely for my own comfort and happiness. I furnished it with pieces I loved, hung art that made me smile, and created a space that was completely, unapologetically mine. David and Sarah managed to find a rental apartment in Queens, though not without making sure I knew how difficult and expensive the process had been. They clearly expected me to offer financial help with the security deposit or the first month's rent, but I didn't. When David called to complain about their new landlord or Sarah texted about how much they missed our old neighborhood, I responded politely but offered no solutions. The distance, both physical and emotional, was exactly what I needed. But the real test came at Christmas. For the first time in years, I wasn't automatically expected to host dinner, to spend days cooking and cleaning for people who would barely acknowledge the effort. I was free to make my own plans, to celebrate however I wanted. I decided to volunteer at a soup kitchen in downtown Brooklyn, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was busy being David and Sarah's unpaid staff. The work was hard but fulfilling, serving meals to people who thanked me genuinely, who saw me as a human being worthy of respect. That's where I met Rosa Martinez, a 76-year-old volunteer who had been working at the soup kitchen for 15 years. Rosa had raised 6 children as a single mother, working multiple jobs to keep her family afloat. Her story was similar to mine in many ways, except for one crucial difference. When her children became adults and started taking advantage of her generosity, she had cut them off immediately. "Love doesn't mean letting people destroy you," Rosa told me one afternoon as we were washing dishes. "Real love requires boundaries. If your children can't love you without bleeding you dry, then they don't really love you at all." Rosa became my first real friend in years. She invited me to her book club, introduced me to her neighbors, and showed me what it looked like to live independently and joyfully in your 70s. Through Rosa, I met other women who had similar stories. Mothers who had been used, exploited, and discarded by the children they'd sacrificed everything for. We weren't bitter old women sitting around complaining. We were survivors, warriors who had fought to reclaim our dignity and our lives. We supported each other, celebrated each other's victories, and created the chosen family that biology had failed to provide. Spring came early that year, and with it, a sense of renewal I hadn't felt in decades. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the local community center, something I'd wanted to do since I was young, but never had time for. My paintings weren't great, but they were mine. Each brushstroke was a choice I made for my own joy, not out of obligation to anyone else. I also started traveling, something that had been impossible when I was constantly available to meet David and Sarah's needs. My first trip was to Vermont, to visit the covered bridges and maple farms I'd seen in magazines, but never imagined I'd experience myself. I stayed in a bed and breakfast run by an elderly couple who treated their guests like cherished friends. For 3 days, I was just Eleanor, not someone's mother or servant, just a woman on her own adventure. The freedom was intoxicating. David and Sarah didn't adjust well to my new independence. They called less frequently, and when they did, the conversations were strained. David tried to guilt me by mentioning how hard things were for them, how much they missed having family close by. Sarah occasionally sent passive-aggressive texts about how other mothers-in-law were so helpful with babysitting and financial support. This was their not-so-subtle way of letting me know they were trying to have a baby and expected me to return to my role as unpaid childcare. I responded with polite but firm detachment. "That sounds challenging," I'd say to David's complaints. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." To Sarah's hints about other mothers-in-law, I'd reply, "How nice for those families." My therapist. Yes, I finally started seeing a therapist, something I'd never been able to afford when I was supporting David and Sarah's lifestyle, helped me understand that these responses weren't cruel. They were healthy. I was no longer absorbing their problems as my own, no longer rushing to solve every difficulty they encountered. "You're not responsible for your adult son's financial or emotional well-being," Dr. Patricia Reeves told me during one of our sessions. "You raised him, educated him, and launched him into the world. Your job as his mother is complete. Anything else you choose to do should be because you want to, not because you're expected to." That summer, something unexpected happened. I received a call from my brother Thomas, whom I hadn't spoken to in over 10 years. Thomas lived in California with his wife and had always been the successful one in our family, the one with the big house, the prestigious job, the picture-perfect life that made everyone else feel inadequate. "Eleanor," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you an apology." It turned out that Thomas had heard about my situation through our cousin Linda. David had apparently been telling people that I'd lost my mind, that I'd selfishly kicked him and Sarah out of their home, and was now living alone like a bitter old woman who had turned against family. But Thomas had his own experience with entitled adult children. His daughter Rebecca had been draining his retirement fund for years, using emotional manipulation and threats of cutting off contact with his grandchildren to keep the money flowing. It had taken him nearly losing his marriage to realize that Rebecca was destroying his life. "I heard what David's been saying about you," Thomas said. "And I know it's not true because I've been there. I know what it's like to have your own child treat you like an ATM with emotions attached." That conversation with Thomas opened a door I'd thought was permanently closed. We began talking regularly, sharing stories of our experiences with our children. supporting each other through the difficult process of maintaining boundaries with people we loved but couldn't trust. Thomas and his wife Linda invited me to spend Thanksgiving with them in San Francisco. It was my first major holiday in years that wasn't defined by cooking for people who didn't appreciate the effort, cleaning up after people who didn't help, and pretending to enjoy the company of people who saw me as useful rather than valuable. Instead, I spent the day with people who genuinely wanted me there. Linda asked about my painting classes and my volunteer work. Thomas showed me around their neighborhood, introducing me to their friends as his amazing sister who's living her best life. We cooked together, laughed together, and shared memories of our childhood that I'd almost forgotten. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not someone's mother or caretaker or solution to a problem, but Eleanor, a complete person with interests, dreams, and value that existed independent of what I could do for others. That Thanksgiving dinner lasted 4 hours, filled with conversation and connection. Nobody checked their phones, nobody made demands, nobody treated me like I was invisible. When it was over, Thomas hugged me and said, "I'm so proud of you, Elle. It takes courage to put yourself first after a lifetime of putting everyone else ahead of you." Winter came again, and with it, the anniversary of that terrible Christmas morning when David and Sarah had ordered me to make them breakfast. I was in my own kitchen now preparing breakfast for myself when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah. "Eleanor, we have something important to tell you. Can we come over tonight?" I stared at the message for a long time, considering my options. Part of me was curious about what they wanted to share. Part of me wondered if they had finally learned to treat me with respect. But mostly, I felt cautious. I had worked too hard to build my new life to let them destabilize it with drama or manipulation. I texted back, "You're welcome to visit, but please call first to make sure I'm available." The fact that I required them to call ahead, that I was no longer automatically available whenever they needed something, was apparently shocking to them. Sarah called immediately. "Eleanor, it's me. Could we come over around 7 tonight? We have some news to share." "What kind of news?" I asked. "We'd rather tell you in person," she said, her voice artificially sweet in that way I'd learned to distrust. "I'm sorry, but if you want to meet, you'll need to give me some idea of what this is about. I have plans this evening, and I'd need to know if this is worth changing them." There was silence on the other end. Sarah clearly wasn't used to me having plans that took priority over her convenience. "We're having a baby," she said finally. "We wanted to tell you in person and talk about how excited we are for you to be a grandmother." My heart did skip a beat at the news. Despite everything, the thought of a grandchild brought genuine joy. But I also recognized the manipulation in her phrasing. How excited we are for you to be a grandmother was code for, "We expect you to return to your old role as unpaid childcare." "That's wonderful news," I said carefully. "Congratulations. But I already have plans tonight that I can't change. Perhaps we could meet for lunch this weekend." "But Eleanor?" Sarah's voice took on that whining tone I remembered so well. "This is important family news. Surely your plans can wait." "My plans are also important," I replied. "If this weekend doesn't work for you, we can find another time." The truth was, my plans involved nothing more exciting than having dinner with Rosa and watching a movie. But they were my plans, chosen by me, for my own enjoyment. That made them important, regardless of how they compared to David and Sarah's announcement. We eventually agreed to meet for brunch that Sunday at a restaurant near my apartment. I chose the place, somewhere public, with good food and limited seating that would discourage them from staying too long or making a scene if the conversation went badly. They arrived 15 minutes late, which was typical. Sarah was already showing slightly, her hand resting protectively on her small bump. David looked tired and stressed, probably worried about the financial implications of having a child when they were still paying rent for the first time in years. "Eleanor, you look different," Sarah said as they sat down. It wasn't necessarily a compliment, more like she was trying to figure out what had changed about me. "I feel different," I replied honestly. "More like myself." We ordered food and made small talk for a while. David told me about his job, which was apparently more demanding but also more lucrative than before. Sarah talked about her pregnancy symptoms and her excitement about decorating a nursery. They seemed to be waiting for something, and I eventually realized they were waiting for me to ask how I could help. In the old days, I would have immediately started planning how I could support them through the pregnancy and beyond. I would have offered to help with medical bills, to buy baby furniture, to provide childcare once the baby arrived. I would have made their problem my problem, their joy my responsibility. Instead, I listened politely and offered appropriate congratulations without volunteering myself for service. Finally, David couldn't stand it anymore. "Mom, aren't you going to ask about how we're managing, about what we need help with?" "Are you asking me for help?" I replied. "Well, yes, obviously. We're going to need support, especially in the first few months. Sarah will need help with the baby, and I'll be working long hours to support our family. What kind of support are you looking for? Sarah leaned forward eagerly. Well, we were thinking you could come over a few days a week to help with the baby, and maybe contribute to some of the expenses. Cribs are so expensive, and don't even get me started on the cost of formula and diapers. There it was. The assumption that I existed to solve their problems, to fill their needs, to sacrifice my comfort for their convenience. They hadn't changed at all. I appreciate that you thought of me, I said carefully, but I won't be able to provide regular childcare or financial support. The silence that followed was deafening. David's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. What do you mean you can't help? This is your grandchild we're talking about. And I'm very excited to meet my grandchild, I replied. I'll be happy to visit occasionally and build a relationship with the baby, but I won't be providing daily childcare or paying for your expenses. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Real or performed, I couldn't tell anymore. But, Eleanor, I was counting on you. I don't know how I'll manage without help. You'll figure it out the same way millions of other parents do. You'll hire a babysitter if you need childcare. You'll budget for the expenses that come with having a child. You'll adapt and learn and grow into your roles as parents. But we can't afford, David started. Then you'll need to make different choices about your spending priorities, I interrupted. Maybe Sarah could work part-time. Maybe you could move to a less expensive area. Maybe you could buy used baby furniture instead of new. These are decisions you'll need to make as parents. The brunch ended badly. David accused me of being heartless and selfish. Sarah cried openly in the restaurant, drawing stares from other diners. They left without saying goodbye, and I sat alone at the table finishing my coffee, feeling sad but not guilty. That afternoon, I called Dr. Reeves to process the encounter. She reminded me that setting boundaries often feels cruel to people who are used to having none. You're not responsible for their inability to plan or budget for their own family, she said. You can love your grandchild without enabling your son and daughter-in-law. Over the next few months, David and Sarah tried various tactics to change my mind. They sent me articles about the importance of grandparents in child development. They had Sarah's mother call me to woman about how grandmothers should support their families. They even tried using the pregnancy itself as leverage, sending me ultrasound photos with captions like, "Your grandchild wants to meet you, and baby needs grandma's help." I saved the ultrasound photos because I genuinely was excited about the baby, but I didn't respond to the manipulation. I sent a beautiful gift for the baby shower, purchased with my own discretionary income, not my emergency funds, and a card expressing my excitement about becoming a grandmother. But I made no promises about ongoing support. The baby was born on a Tuesday in late spring. David called from the hospital, exhaustion and joy evident in his voice, as he told me I had a healthy grandson named Christopher. I cried when I hung up the phone, overwhelmed with love for this little person I hadn't even met yet. I visited the hospital the next day, bringing flowers for Sarah and a small gift for baby Christopher. Holding my grandson for the first time was one of the most profound experiences of my life. He was perfect. Tiny fingers, wisps of dark hair, that incredible newborn smell that somehow makes every adult want to protect and nurture. But even in that moment of pure joy, I remained aware of the dynamics swirling around us. David and Sarah were obviously exhausted and overwhelmed, and I could see them watching me hopefully, waiting for me to offer to move in and help, or at least commit to daily visits to handle feeding and diaper changes. Instead, I held my grandson, told him how much I loved him, and after an hour, I left. I promised to visit again soon, but I made no commitments about serving as unpaid childcare. The weeks that followed were difficult for David and Sarah, as they learned to navigate parenthood without the extensive family support they had expected. Sarah's mother lived in Connecticut and could only visit on weekends. David's paternal leave was limited, and they had to return to the reality of managing a newborn while maintaining their careers. They hired a nanny, something they clearly resented having to pay for. Sarah made several comments about how other grandmothers were so involved with their grandchildren, how lucky some families were to have built-in support systems. I responded with sympathy for their challenges, but no offers to solve them. I did visit Christopher regularly, usually once a week for an hour or two. I brought him books and age-appropriate toys. I held him and talked to him and marveled at his development. I truly loved being his grandmother, but I loved it on my own terms, not as an obligation or expectation. When Christopher was about 6 months old, something shifted. David and Sarah seemed to have settled into their roles as parents, finding a rhythm that worked for their family. They were still tired and stressed, but they had stopped expecting me to rescue them from the realities of parenthood. During one visit, Sarah actually thanked me for a gift I'd brought for Christopher. A simple gesture, but one that felt significant after years of my contributions being treated as automatic and unremarkable. "Eleanor," she said, "I know we've had our differences, but I want you to know that I appreciate you being part of Christopher's life." It wasn't an apology for all the ways they had used and dismissed me, but it was acknowledgement of my value that I hadn't heard in years. That Christmas, nearly 2 years after the morning when David and Sarah had ordered me to make them breakfast, I hosted my own celebration. I invited Thomas and Linda, who flew in from California. I invited Rosa and 2 other friends from my book club. I invited my neighbors Martha and James Chen, who had become dear friends since buying my old house. It was a small gathering, elegant and peaceful. We cooked together, shared stories, and celebrated the season with genuine gratitude for each other's presence. Nobody demanded that I serve them or entertain them or sacrifice my comfort for their convenience. David, Sarah, and Christopher came for Christmas afternoon, staying for a few hours to exchange gifts and share dinner. It was pleasant but not overwhelming, a celebration that included them without revolving around them. Watching Christopher play with the simple wooden blocks I'd given him, seeing him laugh and reach for me when I held out my arms, I felt complete in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I was his grandmother because I chose to be, not because it was expected of me. I loved him freely, without condition, but also without the burden of obligation that had characterized my relationship with his parents. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, Thomas pulled me aside. "You did it, Elle," he said, his voice full of pride. "You took your life back." He was right. Somewhere between selling the house and setting boundaries, between therapy sessions and new friendships, between tears and laughter, I had reclaimed myself. I was no longer defined by what I could do for others, but by who I chose to be. The woman who had stood in her kitchen that Christmas morning, shaking with hurt and anger at her son's demanding text message, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, calmer, more certain of her worth. I still loved David, though our relationship had fundamentally changed. I loved him as the child I had raised, while accepting that the adult he had become was someone I didn't always like or respect. I could love him and still protect myself from him. I could want good things for him without sacrificing myself to provide them. The money from selling the house had given me financial security, but more importantly, the act of selling it had given me emotional freedom. I had learned that I could make major decisions for my own benefit, even when others disapproved. I had discovered that I could survive their anger and disappointment, that their approval was not necessary for my happiness. My apartment in Brooklyn Heights became a sanctuary, filled with things I loved and people who valued me. I painted watercolors of the Manhattan skyline visible from my window. I read books that interested me without guilt about being non-productive. I took long walks along the promenade, feeling grateful for the body that had worked so hard for so many years, and was now free to move at its own pace. Rosa and I traveled together, taking a senior bus tour to Washington, D.C. to see the cherry blossoms, spending a weekend in the Finger Lakes region, tasting wines and laughing like schoolgirls. I had never imagined that friendship in your 70s could be this rich, this rewarding. I also volunteered regularly at the soup kitchen, finding purpose and meaning in work that was appreciated and valued. The people I served there saw me clearly, thanked me genuinely, and reminded me that service should be chosen, not compelled. On quiet evenings, I would sit by my window with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over Manhattan, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this place. The woman who had raised David as a single mother, who had sacrificed everything for his happiness, who had allowed herself to be used and diminished. That woman had been necessary for a time. She had done what she believed was right with the knowledge and strength she had then, but she didn't have to be who I remained. The hardest lesson I learned was that love doesn't require martyrdom. Real love, the kind that builds people up rather than tearing them down, includes boundaries, expectations, and consequences. The love I had shown David and Sarah, the endless giving without asking for anything in return, hadn't made them better people. If anything, it had made them worse. By requiring them to stand on their own, by refusing to enable their selfishness and sense of entitlement, I had given them the opportunity to grow up. Whether they took that opportunity was up to them. Christopher is 3 now, a bright, energetic little boy who calls me Gamma and runs to hug me when I visit. He doesn't know about the years of drama between his parents and me, the conflicts over money and boundaries and respect. To him, I'm just Gamma, someone who reads him stories, brings him interesting toys, and pays attention when he shows me his latest accomplishment. That's exactly how I want it to be. My relationship with my grandson is clean, uncomplicated by the baggage that weighs down my relationship with his parents. I love him freely, enjoy him completely, and spoil him moderately. When our visits end, I leave knowing that I've given him my best without sacrificing my peace. David and Sarah have grown as parents and, to some extent, as people. They're still not the grateful, considerate adults I once hoped they would become, but they're more responsible than they were when they were living off my resources. Having to pay their own bills and solve their own problems has forced them to develop skills they never needed when I was always there to rescue them. Our relationship is cordial now, built on mutual respect rather than my unconditional giving. They no longer expect me to drop everything when they need help, and I no longer feel obligated to provide solutions for their problems. When they ask for advice, I give it. When they need emotional support, I offer it. But I don't give them money, babysitting services, or unlimited access to my time and energy. This Christmas, I'm planning to spend the morning volunteering at the soup kitchen, serving breakfast to people who will thank me sincerely for the simple act of kindness. In the afternoon, I'll visit David, Sarah, and Christopher for a few hours, bringing gifts and sharing dinner. In the evening, I'll return to my own apartment, where Rosa is joining me for wine and old movies. It's a far cry from the Christmas morning 2 years ago when I stood in my kitchen, reading that demanding text message and feeling like a stranger in my own life. That woman who felt so invisible, so used, so trapped by her own generosity. She's not gone entirely. Sometimes I still hear her voice whispering that I should do more, give more, sacrifice more for the people I love. But now I have other voices too. Dr. Reeves's voice reminding me that boundaries are healthy. Rosa's voice encouraging me to put myself first sometimes. Thomas's voice telling me I deserve respect. And my own voice, stronger now than it's been in years, insisting that my value isn't determined by what I can do for others. The house on the Upper West Side where I raised David, where I sacrificed so much of myself trying to create the perfect home, is thriving under Martha and James Chen's care. They've renovated the kitchen, painted the bedrooms in bright colors, and filled the rooms with their twins' artwork and laughter. When I walk past it occasionally, I feel no regret for selling it. It's serving its purpose, sheltering a family, holding love, just not my family anymore. My apartment in Brooklyn Heights serves a different purpose. It's not about housing anyone else or meeting anyone else's needs. It's about providing me with a space to be fully myself, to pursue my interests, to entertain people who value my company rather than my services. The financial security I gained from selling the house has allowed me to live without fear, to say no without worrying about my survival. I have enough money for my needs and some of my wants. I can afford to travel occasionally, to buy books and art supplies, to take Rosa to dinner when we feel like celebrating. I don't have wealth by any measure, but I have enough and I have peace of mind. That peace of mind is worth more than any amount of money I might have given to David and Sarah over the years. It's worth more than their temporary approval or their conditional affection. It's worth more than the illusion of being needed that came from constantly rescuing them from consequences they should have faced. I learned that being needed and being valued are not the same thing. I was needed when I was useful, when I provided services or resources that made their lives easier. But I wasn't valued as a person, as a woman with her own needs and dreams and worth. Now, at 74, I am valued by the people who matter. Rosa values my friendship. Thomas values my wisdom. Martha and James value my neighborliness. The people at the soup kitchen value my service. Christopher values my love. These relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not on what I can provide or do. And most importantly, I value myself. I wake up in the morning looking forward to my day, not dreading it. I make choices based on what brings me joy or peace or purpose, not on what others expect from me. I wear clothes I like, eat food I enjoy, spend time with people who make me laugh. Sometimes I think about the woman I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Always giving, always accommodating, always putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. I don't regret her entirely. She did what she thought was right with the tools she had. She raised a child, maintained a home, worked hard, and loved deeply. But she also enabled selfishness, tolerated disrespect, and taught the people around her that her needs didn't matter. She confused love with sacrifice and giving with generosity. She thought that being good meant being endlessly available to others, never understanding that goodness also requires self-respect and boundaries. I honor what she accomplished while celebrating who I've become. The journey from her to me wasn't easy. It involved difficult conversations, painful realizations, and the courage to disappoint people I loved. But it was necessary. If I could go back and talk to the woman standing in that kitchen on Christmas morning, reading that demanding text from her son, I would tell her that she has a choice. I would tell her that love without respect isn't really love at all. I would tell her that she deserves better, that she can have better, that it's not too late to change the story. I would tell her what I learned, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses. That boundaries aren't walls. They're gates that can open for people who approach with respect and close to those who don't. That saying no to some things means you can say yes to better things. Most of all, I would tell her that she matters. Not just as a mother or a caretaker or a convenient solution to other people's problems, but as a complete person deserving of respect, consideration, and kindness. Looking back now, I realize that selling the house was never really about the money, or even about punishing David and Sarah for their behavior. It was about reclaiming my agency, my right to make decisions about my own life. It was about refusing to accept a role that diminished me, and choosing instead to write my own story. That story isn't finished yet. I have years ahead of me, hopefully many years, filled with possibilities I'm still discovering. I might travel more, take up new hobbies, deepen existing friendships, or make new ones. I might volunteer in different ways, explore parts of the city I've never seen, or learn skills I've always wanted to develop. What I won't do is spend those years trying to earn love through service, or prove my worth through sacrifice. I won't allow anyone, family or otherwise, to take advantage of my kindness or exploit my generosity. I won't pretend that peacekeeping is the same thing as loving, or that avoiding conflict is more important than maintaining my dignity. The woman who once stood in her kitchen shaking with hurt and anger has learned to stand differently now. Straighter, calmer, more certain of her place in the world. And that woman, this woman I've become, knows that she deserves all the love, respect, and kindness she spent so many years giving to others. But there's more to this story that I haven't shared yet. More lessons learned, more challenges faced, and more moments of grace that came from choosing myself over the expectations of others. Because the truth is, the journey of reclaiming your life after decades of giving it away doesn't end with one dramatic decision. It continues day by day, choice by choice, boundary by boundary. One of the most unexpected developments came 6 months after Christopher turned 3. I was volunteering at the soup kitchen on a particularly busy Saturday when a young woman approached me during cleanup. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her until she spoke. "Mrs. Eleanor? I'm Katie Morrison. I used to be one of David's friends in high school." I remembered Katie then, a sweet girl who had spent many afternoons at our kitchen table, doing homework with David and eating my homemade cookies. She had always been polite, helping with dishes without being asked, saying please and thank you in a way that made me feel appreciated. "Katie, how wonderful to see you," I said, genuinely pleased. "What brings you here?" She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I've been volunteering here for about a year now. After my divorce, I needed something that reminded me that there was still good in the world." We talked for a while as we finished cleaning up, and I learned that Katie had been through her own difficult journey. Married young to a man who gradually became controlling and financially abusive, she had finally found the courage to leave when her daughter was 12. Now, at 38, she was rebuilding her life as a single mother, working as a nurse and volunteering when she could. "You know," Katie said as we were leaving, "I always remembered how kind you were when we were kids. Your house was the one place where I felt truly welcome, where I felt seen and valued. My own mother was, well, she had her own problems. But you made me feel like I mattered." Her words moved me more than I could express. Here was someone whose life I had touched positively without even realizing it, someone who remembered my kindness from decades ago. It reminded me that my value as a person had never been dependent on David's appreciation or lack thereof. I had always been making a difference, even when it wasn't acknowledged. Katie and I began meeting regularly for coffee, and through her, I gained new perspective on my relationship with David. She remembered him as charming but self-centered, someone who took others' generosity for granted even as a teenager. "I always wondered how you managed to stay so patient with him," she said during one of our conversations. Even then, he had this way of expecting everyone to revolve around his needs. It was validating to hear this from someone who had observed our family dynamics from the outside, someone who had no agenda in sharing these memories. It helped me understand that David's entitled behavior hadn't developed suddenly in adulthood. I had just been too close to the situation, too invested in seeing only his good qualities, to recognize the patterns that others could see clearly. Around this same time, I received an unexpected phone call that would further challenge my understanding of family loyalty and obligation. It was from my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Goldstein, who lived 3 doors down from my old brownstone. She had been battling cancer and wanted to share something that had been weighing on her mind. "Eleanor," she said, her voice weak but determined, "I need to tell you what I witnessed during those years when David and Sarah were living with you. I kept quiet because I didn't want to interfere, but now that you've made your choice, I think you should know. What she told me left me stunned and heartbroken. Mrs. Goldstein had overheard numerous conversations between David and Sarah on their front stoop. Conversations where they openly mocked me, complained about having to live with the old lady, and discussed strategies for getting more money out of me. She had watched them throw dinner parties where they joked about my cooking and complained about my intrusions into their space. She had seen them entertaining friends by imitating my voice and ridiculing my concerns about household expenses. "They called you their golden goose," Mrs. Goldstein said, her voice breaking slightly. "I heard Sarah tell her friend that they just had to put up with you until they could figure out how to get you to give them enough money to buy their own place. I'm sorry I never said anything, but I thought it wasn't my place." I thanked Mrs. Goldstein for her honesty, though her words cut deeply. Part of me wished I hadn't learned this information. There was something especially painful about knowing that my son and his wife had ridiculed me to their friends, turned my generosity into a joke, reduced me to a mere source of financial benefit. But another part of me felt vindicated. My decision to sell the house and establish boundaries hadn't been an overreaction or a moment of spite. I had been protecting myself from people who truly saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. The healing that followed this revelation was complex. I felt grief for the relationship I had thought I had with David, anger at the depth of their disrespect, and relief that I had trusted my instincts and removed myself from such a toxic situation. Dr. Reeves helped me work through these conflicting emotions, reminding me that grieving the loss of an illusion is a necessary part of accepting reality. "You weren't wrong to love them," she told me. "You weren't wrong to want to help them. You were only wrong in continuing to pour yourself into people who had shown you repeatedly that they didn't value what you were offering." During this period of processing and healing, I also deepened my understanding of what healthy family relationships could look like. My growing closeness with Thomas and Linda provided a beautiful contrast to the dysfunction I had tolerated with David and Sarah. When Thomas visited New York for a business trip, he insisted on staying in a hotel rather than inconveniencing me, even though I had offered him my guest room. When I sent Christmas gifts to his grandchildren, Linda called to thank me and share how much the children had enjoyed them. When I mentioned that I was considering a cruise for my 75th birthday, they offered to help me plan and research options, genuinely excited about my adventure. These interactions highlighted what I had been missing: reciprocity, consideration, genuine appreciation, and respect for my autonomy. Thomas and Linda treated me like a beloved family member, not a service provider. They were interested in my happiness for its own sake, not for what it might provide them. They honored my choices without trying to manipulate them to their advantage. The contrast was illuminating, but also painful. It forced me to acknowledge just how abnormal my relationship with David and Sarah had become, how far I had allowed my standards to erode in the name of keeping the peace and being a good mother. My 75th birthday became a celebration of this new understanding of my worth. Instead of waiting for David to remember the date, which he had forgotten for the past 3 years, I planned my own party. I rented a small private dining room at a favorite restaurant in Brooklyn Heights and invited the people who had become my chosen family: Rosa, Katie, several friends from my book club, Martha and James Chen, and Thomas and Linda, who flew in from California specifically for the celebration. The evening was magical. Everyone who attended was there because they genuinely wanted to celebrate me. The conversation was lively and engaging, filled with laughter and stories and genuine connection. People asked about my paintings, my volunteer work, my travel plans. They listened to my answers with real interest, not polite patience. I felt seen, valued, and appreciated in a way that I had almost forgotten was possible. David and Sarah did remember my birthday that year. Sarah sent a text message 2 days late with, "Happy belated birthday. Hope you had a nice day." No phone call, no card, no acknowledgement that this was a milestone birthday, or any expression of regret for their tardiness. Their response perfectly encapsulated the casual disregard that had characterized our relationship for years, but their indifference didn't sting the way it once would have. I was surrounded by people who did care, people who had shown up for me in meaningful ways. I posted photos from my party on social media, something I rarely did, but I wanted to document this joyful moment surrounded by love and appreciation. The summer after my 75th birthday brought another unexpected development. Christopher, now 4 years old, began staying overnight with me occasionally on weekends. This wasn't the result of any pressure or manipulation from David and Sarah. In fact, they seemed somewhat reluctant about it. The overnights happened because Christopher had specifically asked for them. "Gamma," he had said during one of my weekly visits, "can I sleep at your house sometime? I want to see your paintings and watch movies with you like Mommy and Daddy do at home." Sarah had looked uncomfortable with the request, probably worried about losing control of the narrative around our relationship. But David, to his credit, had supported his son's desire to spend time with me. If Mom's okay with it, and you promise to be good, I think that could work. Having Christopher in my space for extended periods was both delightful and illuminating. Away from his parents' influence, he was curious about my life in ways that adults rarely were. He asked about my paintings, helped me tend to my small herb garden on the balcony, and listened with rapt attention when I told him stories about his daddy's childhood. But he also made observations that were startlingly perceptive for someone so young. "Gamma, why does Mommy get mad when Daddy talks about you?" he asked one evening as we were reading together. I was careful in my response, not wanting to burden him with adult conflicts, but also not wanting to dismiss his astute observation. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings about each other, sweetheart, but what matters is that Daddy loves you, and Mommy loves you, and Gamma loves you very much." "I know," he said, snuggling closer. "But I think Mommy doesn't like it when I'm happy about seeing you." His words broke my heart. Even at 4, Christopher was already learning to navigate the emotional manipulation that characterized his parents' relationship with me. He was developing strategies to hide his affection for me when it conflicted with what he sensed his mother expected. I made a decision that night to ensure that Christopher's relationship with me remained as clean and uncomplicated as possible. I would never speak negatively about his parents in his presence, never use him as a messenger between myself and David and Sarah, never put him in a position where he felt he had to choose sides. My love for him would be unconditional and freely given, without strings or agendas. This decision was tested when Sarah began subtly interrogating Christopher after his visits with me. He would return home happy and excited, full of stories about our adventures, only to be deflated by questions like, "Did Gamma say anything about Mommy and Daddy?" Or, "Did Gamma seem sad that we don't visit her more often?" Christopher, being an intuitive child, began to sense that his enthusiasm about our time together was problematic for his mother. During one of his overnight visits, he asked me, "Gamma, should I not tell Mommy about the fun stuff we do?" Again, I was careful in my response. "You can always tell Mommy and Daddy about our time together, sweetheart. You should never feel like you need to hide anything. If they ask questions, just tell them the truth about what we did." "But what if the truth makes Mommy upset?" His question revealed the impossible position Sarah was putting him in, forcing a 4-year-old to manage her adult insecurities and jealousies. It made me even more determined to keep my relationship with Christopher pure and simple, focused entirely on his well-being rather than on any complicated adult dynamics. As Christopher grew older and our relationship deepened, I began to see glimpses of his father in him, but also glimpses of the man I had hoped David would become. Christopher was naturally empathetic, genuinely grateful for kindness shown to him, and considerate of others' feelings. Whether this was his natural temperament or something that could be shaped by positive influences remained to be seen, but I was determined to be one of those positive influences in whatever way I could. The holidays that 5th year after selling the house brought a new tradition that perfectly encapsulated the life I had built for myself. Instead of focusing Christmas around other people's expectations, I created a celebration that brought me joy and meaning. Christmas morning was still devoted to volunteering at the soup kitchen, but now Katie joined me, bringing her teenage daughter Maya, who had become like an honorary granddaughter to me. Christmas afternoon was reserved for David, Sarah, and Christopher, but within clear boundaries that I had established and maintained. They could visit for 3 hours, during which we would exchange gifts, share a meal I had prepared because I enjoyed cooking for special occasions, and spend time together as a family. But the visit had a defined beginning and end, and I no longer felt obligated to extend it if it wasn't going well, or to sacrifice my own plans to accommodate their last-minute changes. Christmas evening belonged to my chosen family, Rosa, Thomas, and Linda when they were in town, Martha and James, and often Katie and Maya. We would have wine and dessert, play board games, and enjoy each other's company in a relaxed, pressure-free environment. These evening gatherings were consistently the highlight of my holiday season, filled with laughter, genuine conversation, and mutual appreciation. The contrast between the two parts of my Christmas celebration was stark, but not bitter. I had learned to accept my relationship with David and Sarah for what it was, cordial but limited, pleasant but not deeply fulfilling. I no longer tried to force it to be more than they were capable of offering, which paradoxically made it less painful and more sustainable. Christopher's presence was the bridge between these two worlds. During the afternoon family visit, he was the grandchild of David and Sarah, subject to their hovering and their subtle attempts to control the narrative. During his occasional overnight visits, he was simply my beloved grandson, free to be curious, enthusiastic, and naturally affectionate without worrying about his parents' reaction. One particularly meaningful moment came when Christopher was 6 years old. David and Sarah had been discussing financial pressures in front of him. Concerns about his school tuition, their mortgage payment, Sarah's reduced work hours. Christopher had absorbed this adult anxiety, as children do, and during one of his visits with me, he offered me a small toy car from his collection. "Gamma, you can sell this if you need money," he said solemnly. "Mommy and Daddy are always worried about money, so I thought maybe you need some too." His innocent generosity, his willingness to sacrifice something he treasured, reminded me so much of my own childhood impulse to take care of others that it took my breath away. But it also broke my heart that he was already learning to carry adult worries, already developing the burden of feeling responsible for others' financial well-being. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to his level. "That's so kind of you to think of Gamma, but I don't need your toy car. Gamma has enough money for what she needs. And it's not your job to worry about grown-up money problems, okay? Your job is just to be 6 years old and have fun and learn new things. But Mommy says families help each other when they need money." "You're right that families help each other," I replied carefully. "But there are different ways to help. Children help by being good and kind and loving, which you already do perfectly. Money help is for grown-ups to figure out among themselves." The conversation troubled me deeply, not because of Christopher's generous impulse, but because of what it revealed about the messages he was receiving at home. David and Sarah were already beginning to teach him that love was measured by financial sacrifice, that family members were obligated to solve each other's problems, that anxiety about money was a normal and acceptable burden to share with children. I made a renewed commitment that day to model different values during my time with Christopher. In my home, love was expressed through attention, time, and genuine care. Problems were solved by adults without involving children in the stress or responsibility. Generosity was chosen freely, not compelled by guilt or manipulation. This commitment was tested again a few months later when David called me with what he presented as an emergency. Sarah's father had been hospitalized with a heart attack, and Sarah needed to travel to Connecticut immediately to be with her family. Their nanny was on vacation. David couldn't take time off work for the full week that Sarah might be gone, and they needed someone to care for Christopher. "Mom, I know we usually give you more notice, but we're really in a bind here. Could you possibly watch Christopher for the week? We'd be so grateful." The old Eleanor would have immediately said yes, canceling whatever plans she had, rearranging her schedule, and throwing herself into the task of providing full-time childcare for a week. The new Eleanor considered her response more carefully. "I'm sorry to hear about Sarah's father," I said. "I hope he recovers quickly. I can watch Christopher for 2 of those days. Wednesday and Thursday are free for me. For the other days, you'll need to make alternative arrangements." "But Mom, what are we supposed to do about the other days? We don't have anyone else." "You're creative, capable adults," I replied. "You'll figure something out. Maybe you can find a temporary babysitter through an agency. Maybe one of Sarah's friends could help. Maybe you could work different schedules so one of you is always home. There are solutions available. They just require effort and probably some money." David's frustration was evident in his voice. "It would be so much easier if you could just help us for the week. Christopher loves spending time with you, and I love spending time with Christopher. That's why I'm happy to help for 2 days. But I have other commitments and responsibilities that I can't just set aside because you didn't plan for this contingency." The truth was that my other commitments included a book club meeting, a painting class, and lunch plans with Rosa, none of which were emergencies or couldn't technically be rescheduled. But they were my commitments, chosen by me for my enjoyment and well-being. They had value precisely because they were mine, not because they were obligations to others. David and Sarah did manage to cobble together childcare for the week, hiring a babysitter for 3 days, and arranging for Sarah's sister to help with the others. Christopher spent his 2 days with me, and we had a wonderful time visiting the Children's Museum, baking cookies, and reading together. But I maintained my boundaries, refusing to extend my help when David called Wednesday evening to ask if I could possibly keep Christopher through the weekend. "I understand that would be convenient for you," I said, "but I made a commitment for 2 days, and that's what I'm able to provide. Christopher has been delightful, and I've enjoyed every minute with him, but he'll need to go home tomorrow as planned." The incident reinforced an important lesson I had learned about boundaries. They only work if you maintain them consistently, even when it would be easier to bend them. Every time I held firm, every time I said no to requests that exceeded my stated limits, I reinforced the new dynamic I had worked so hard to establish. I also modeled for Christopher that adults could be reliable and consistent, that boundaries weren't punishments but rather clear frameworks that made relationships work better. As Christopher entered school age and began developing his own activities and friendships, our relationship evolved again. He was less available for overnight visits, more absorbed in the social world of childhood. But during the time we did spend together, our connection deepened. He would tell me about his friends, his teachers, his favorite subjects in school. I would share stories from my own childhood, teach him card games that my mother had taught me, and listen to his observations about the world with the seriousness they deserved. One afternoon, when Christopher was 7, he made a comment that revealed how much he had internalized from our time together. We were at the playground, and he was watching another child being scolded harshly by his mother for some minor transgression. "Gamma?" Christopher said quietly. "That mommy seems really angry about something that isn't very important. What makes you think it isn't very important?" I asked. "Well, he just dropped his juice box, and she's yelling at him like he broke something expensive. When I spill things at your house, you just help me clean it up and remind me to be more careful next time." His observation revealed that he was learning to distinguish between proportional and disproportional responses, between guidance and punishment, between patience and anger. He was developing emotional intelligence through experiencing consistent, calm responses to typical childhood mistakes. "Different families handle things in different ways," I said carefully. "But you're right that some problems are bigger than others, and it's important for grown-ups to match their reaction to the size of the problem." "I like visiting you because you don't get upset about little things," he said. "It makes me feel safe to try new stuff because I know you won't yell at me if I mess up." His words filled me with profound gratitude. Despite all the complications with his parents, despite the years of dysfunction and manipulation I had endured, something beautiful had emerged from the wreckage. I had been able to offer Christopher a relationship that felt safe, accepting, and nurturing. I had given him the gift of unconditional love without the burden of impossible expectations. As I write this now, Christopher is 8 years old, a bright, funny, thoughtful boy who lights up my world every time I see him. David and Sarah have settled into their roles as parents, still occasionally trying to manipulate me into providing more help than I'm comfortable giving, but also seeming to accept the boundaries I've established. We have found a way to coexist that works for everyone, even if it's not the fantasy of perfect family harmony that I once desperately wanted. My life at 76 is rich and full in ways I never could have imagined during those dark years of being taken for granted. I volunteer regularly at 3 different organizations now: the Soup Kitchen, a literacy program for adults, and a visiting program for elderly residents in assisted living facilities. Each of these commitments brings me immense satisfaction because they represent choices I've made to contribute positively to my community. I've traveled to places I dreamed of seeing: Ireland with Rosa, where we traced her family's genealogy and drank Guinness in tiny pubs; a Mediterranean cruise with a group from my book club, where I painted watercolors of ancient ruins and sunset seascapes; a train trip through the Canadian Rockies with Thomas and Linda, where we marveled at the dramatic landscapes and reconnected with childhood memories of family vacations. My apartment has become a gathering place for the chosen family I've created. Rosa and I host a monthly dinner party where we cook together and invite interesting people to join us. Katie brings Maya over regularly, and I've become like a surrogate grandmother to this remarkable teenager who shares my love of books and art. Martha and James Chen have keys to my apartment and check on me when I'm traveling, watering my plants and collecting my mail with the care and attention of devoted friends. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned to enjoy my own company in ways I never did when I was constantly focused on serving others. I can spend an entire Sunday painting by my window, watching the light change over Manhattan, without feeling guilty about being unproductive. I can read for hours without interruption, make myself elaborate meals that nobody else would enjoy, take long baths with expensive bath salts, and go to bed whenever I feel like it. The financial security from selling the house continues to provide peace of mind. I've been able to update my wardrobe, replace furniture that was worn out, and splurge occasionally on experiences that bring me joy. I've also been able to be genuinely generous with the people I care about, buying beautiful gifts for Christopher, treating Rosa to spa days for her birthday, contributing meaningfully to the organizations where I volunteer. This generosity feels different from the compulsive giving that characterized my relationship with David and Sarah. It's chosen, not compelled. It's appreciated, not taken for granted. It enhances my relationships rather than diminishing them, and it comes from abundance rather than scarcity. Looking ahead to whatever years remain to me, I feel excited rather than anxious. I have plans and dreams that are entirely my own. I want to take a painting workshop in Tuscany, learn to play the piano, perhaps write a memoir about this journey of reclaiming my life. I have people who care about me, activities that engage me, and a sense of purpose that comes from choosing how to spend my time and energy. The relationship with David and Sarah will continue to evolve, hopefully in positive directions as they mature and as Christopher grows older. But whatever happens with them, I know now that my happiness and well-being are not dependent on their approval or affection. I can love them and wish them well while protecting myself from their capacity to cause me harm. This is the final lesson I want to share with anyone who recognizes their own story in mine. It is never too late to reclaim your life. No matter how many years you've spent putting everyone else's needs first, no matter how entrenched the patterns of giving and taking have become, you have the power to change the dynamic. You deserve to be treated with respect and consideration. You deserve to have your own dreams and boundaries and priorities. You deserve to experience the joy of relationships built on mutual caring, rather than one-sided sacrifice. The woman who stood in her kitchen that Christmas morning, reading a demanding text from her son and feeling like a stranger in her own life, found the courage to transform everything. If she could do it at 72, anyone can do it at any age. It's never too late to start honoring yourself the way you've honored others. It's never too late to discover who you are when you're not busy being who everyone else needs you to be. And it's never too late to learn that the greatest gift you can give to the people you love is the example of a person who values herself enough to insist on being valued by others. Have you ever lived something like this? Have you ever found yourself giving and giving until you had nothing left, only to realize that the people you were giving to saw your generosity as obligation rather than gift? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. So many of us have walked similar paths, learning the hard way that love requires boundaries, and that kindness must include kindness to ourselves. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. When we share these experiences, we help each other heal. We remind each other that we're not alone in these struggles, and that it's never too late to reclaim our worth and rewrite our stories. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me open my heart to you today. Thank you for reminding me, through your attention and care, that my story matters, that my journey has value, and that in sharing our truth, we create the loving community that we all deserve.